Hello friends, so after completing the topic of spermatogenesis in the previous lecture, today we are going to talk about the topic of oogenesis, which is a bit a complex process, so you need to pay more and more attention to this topic. Anyways, when we start with oogenesis, let us understand the definition of oogenesis. What do you mean by oogenesis? Oogenesis is the formation of ovum, ideally it is said like that. And we also said that when the ovum is released from ovary, it is called as ovulation. But let me point out to you one thing over here, that the ovum is released at a stage called secondary oocyte. So remember that though we define it as formation of ovum, right, the ovum is not completely formed. Ovum is released right at which stage? Secondary oocyte. And then after certain processes occurs and that ovum is formed from that secondary oocyte. Right, so it is a kind of incomplete thing, and when the sperm enters, the secondary oocyte will result into the formation of ovum. So this is something to be noted very particularly. Now when does this process starts? This process starts at fetal life. Means what? When I was at the fetal stage, in my body, along with the formation of my body, let me tell you that oogenesis also begins. So it starts at the fetal life only. Like जब भी female fetus stage में होती है, खुद fetus stage में होती है, जैसे कि मैं अगर fetus stage में हूँ, तो तभी मेरी body में oogenesis का process start हो गया था. तो वो continue रहता है. कब तक रहता है? तो वो रहता है continue menopause तक. Right? तो ये है oogenesis का process जिसे हम study करेंगे अब. Now let's say that this is the what you can say oogenesis, formation of ovum. Sometimes often it is called as secondary oocyte, that is a female gamete. In the ovary is what you call it as oogenesis. Now if we talk about it, starts at the fetal life. Embryonic stage से ही कह सकते हैं कि ये शुरू हो जाता है. Alright. Ovary is having a germinal epithelium inside it, which is made up of cuboidal epithelium. Right. So during the fetal life, you can see I have marked over here. Right. During the fetal life, what happens that the germinal epithelium of ovary keeps on dividing and dividing by the process of mitosis. Remember. So germinal epithelium से mitosis होके what is coming out? Oogonia. This oogonia undergoes mitosis again and it forms primary oocyte. Remember this. So I have not written the ploidy level, which I'll write here, don't worry. So this is going to be 2n, this is also going to be 2n. So as you know that diploid condition, मतलब यहाँ से यहाँ तक, what will be the number of chromosomes? The number of chromosomes will be diploid and that will be 46 numbers of chromosomes. So it occurs and primary oocyte is formed. Now after certain period of time, means what? This is occurring during the fetal life and right during the birth, means when a child is born, when a female child is born, at that time in her ovary, what happens? The primary oocyte gets surrounded by some cells. You can see the cells, the name is granulosa cells. So this primary oocyte at birth से मतलब पूरा उसका जो चाइल्डहुड होता है वहां तक, तो उसमें क्या होता है कि द प्राइमरी oocytes कीप्स ऑन फॉर्मिंग, उसके सराउंडिंग में कुछ सेल्स बनते रहते हैं. दिस सेल्स आर नोन एज ग्रेन्युलोसा सेल्स. सो दिस इज इनसाइड दिस प्राइमरी oocyte सराउंडेड बाय द ग्रेन्युलोसा सेल्स. Right? Now these two things together, that is granulosa cells and primary oocytes, forms primary follicle. So let me tell you that oocyte is single cell. If it is surrounded by the other cells, it becomes a follicle. Right? So this is the main point which you need to remember. So primary oocyte is inside the primary follicle. Follicle is composed of oocyte plus granulosa cells. Now this is at the time of birth. Now at the time of birth, there are almost 2 million primary follicles. How many? 2 million. Right. But that keeps on degenerating further and almost 60 to 80,000 remains in each ovary. Remember this. कितने follicles रह जाते हैं primary follicles birth के time पे? it's 60 to 80,000 in each ovary. मतलब a female has primary follicles during the time of birth, her birth, right? It's like when I was born, how many follicles did my each ovary had? It is 60 to 80,000 primary follicles, inside which primary oocyte was present. Now, so this is like the birth of the girl child has occurred, and at the birth time 60 to 80,000 primary follicles are present in each ovary. After that, in the primary follicle, now whatever division is going to take place is going to take in this oocyte. Okay? डिविजन जितने भी होंगे वो उस साइट के होंगे और डेवलपमेंट फॉलिकल का होगा. कीप इट वेरी क्लियर इन योर माइंड. ठीक है, डिविजन किसका होता है? द डिविजन इज ऑफ oocyte, whereas the growth is of the follicle. Well, so this primary oocyte undergoes meiosis 1. Meiosis 1 has started. That means what? It is a reduction division. But let me tell you that this meiosis 1 is not completed. It gives a pause. एक pause पे आके वो रुक जाता है. कौन? Primary oocyte. So primary oocyte birth के बाद एक pause पे आ जाता है. It is undergoing a pause condition. And at what stage does this meiosis stops? This meiosis stops at meiosis 1 stops at prophase. Okay. Prophase 1 at diplotin. Remember this. So meiosis 1 का जो prophase होता है उसके diplotin stage पे आके क्या होता है? प्राइमरी फॉलिकल अरेस्ट हो जाता है. वो आगे डिवाइड नहीं होता. It does not divide further. So I'll repeat again the point. The primary oocyte inside the primary follicle gets arrested. Okay. So this cell is getting arrested, is not getting further divided, and meiosis के कौन से stage पे? Prophase, and particularly in that what you can say is diplotin stage पे आके वो rest हो जाता है. And this is what you call it as first resting phase. What do we call it as? First resting phase. So this is the frequently asked question in NEET or in board, and it is even an important point कि primary oocyte जो होता है वो कौन से फर्स्ट रेस्टिंग डिवीजन पे पॉज देता है? लाइक इन विच स्टेज द प्राइमरी oocyte gets arrested. So you have to remember that it is the meiosis 1 in that prophase and in that diplotin stage. So this is the first resting phase. After that, the DNA gets concentrated in the primary oocyte and its nucleus, and the follicle starts growing. So as I have told you that this is a primary follicle, almost 60 to 80,000 follicles are there, and so this follicle starts growing. Now you can see this. This is a layer of granulosa cell, and this is primary oocyte. Now this primary oocyte is arrested at meiosis 1. Still this is the same, but now this follicle is a bit larger follicle, and it is having one layer outside, and this is what you call it as theca externa. What do we call it as? Theca externa. So one layer develops after the follicle surrounding the granulosa cell, and this is what you call it as theca externa. So what is a characteristic feature of a secondary follicle? You can say that it develops an external layer outside it. That is what you call it as theca. It is also referred to be as theca externa. So, and still what we can say, this is a secondary follicle. Still the process is going on. This process is going on from childhood to puberty, right? So still we will see now. Now what we are going to see further? It is yet arrested, right? So now चाइल्डहुड प्रोग्रेस करेगा, और साथ साथ में अब हम क्या देखेंगे? तो हम देखेंगे वी विल सी द फॉलिकल ग्रोथ. तो यहां से अब फॉलिकल का ग्रोथ होता रहता है, राइट? सो दिस इज व्हाट वी आर गोइंग टू सी. A quick revision once again for my satisfaction. I will say that first of all, germinal epithelium से mitosis से oogonia, mitosis से primary oocyte, right? Primary oocyte is surrounded by granulosa cells, which forms primary follicle. It starts meiosis 1, right? It starts meiosis 1, which is not completed. So yet all the stages, yet diploid condition. it forms a secondary follicle which is surrounded by a layer extra outside which is called as theca externa. So this is what you call it as secondary follicle. So we have seen that the secondary follicle was formed. Now what is secondary follicle? You can see that a layer of granulosa cells, primary oocyte arrested at meiosis 1 and one layer has developed, that is what you call it as theca externa. And this all has begun at what stage? You can say that childhood to puberty is yet going on, right? So we stopped here at childhood and it is yet going on. So it will go up till which stage? It will go up till the puberty stage. Okay. Now this secondary follicle will grow in size. As it will grow in size, already it is having this theca externa, right? It is having this theca externa which is a tough fibrous structure. You can see over here, right? After it grows, it develops one another layer that is called as theca interna. And it starts developing a small cavity inside it, right? So the cell starts scattering and it starts developing a cavity inside. So this is what you call it as tertiary follicle. Remember that yet there is a primary oocyte only, but the follicle is growing in a size. So this was secondary follicle and this is tertiary follicle. So what is the difference? Oocyte at same stage, but just granulosa cell has been added, a cavity in between them has been developed, starts developing, and two layer on the outer side has started developing, that is theca externa and theca interna included. So this is a larger size follicle and we call it as tertiary follicle. So yet after this tertiary follicle is getting converted into the mature follicle, right? It is getting converted into a mature follicle, and what do we call it as? We call it as a Graafian follicle. So this Graafian follicle was formed by D graft, so it is known as the Graafian follicle. Now when is this Graafian follicle formed? This Graafian follicle is formed at puberty at every month. Remember, the follicles keep growing out every month, and you know that after every month the female starts menstruating. So exactly what happens? Graafian follicle. So this follicle keeps on maturing, it forms Graafian follicle. So what is exactly Graafian follicle? Now here we have seen that in this tertiary follicle, primary oocyte is arrested still at meiosis 1. But here in this Graafian follicle, you have to remember that the meiosis 1 is completed. Means what? The first resting stage is completed by this primary oocyte, right? So this primary oocyte divides into two unequal division. Okay, it is meiosis 1 is getting completed, but it produces two cells in an unequal size, right? So which is that two cells? So from primary oocyte, one thing that is produced over here is secondary oocyte. You can see over here. And the second small cell which is formed is first polar body. So the primary oocyte completes its first meiosis 1 and produces two haploid cells. From this two haploid cell, one is the secondary oocyte and the another one is the first polar body, right? And so why this unequal division? You should have a question that why one cell is large and one cell is small. So the larger cell is known as the secondary oocyte, whereas the smaller cell is known as the first polar body. Now why this kind of unequal division? The reason behind unequal division is what? Okay, if the ovum is getting much nutrition or the nourishment, it will develop in a better way. So one is getting a better, cytoplasmic content, so it can get a better nourishment, whereas the another remains small and it degenerates. So what degenerates? The first polar body will degenerate because it is having a less nutrition or less nutrients. Okay, so this is like you can say that meiosis 1 is getting completed at what stage? When the follicle is growing into a Graafian follicle. And Graafian follicle is a mature follicle. Okay. So after some time, you can say that we already know that this is theca externa, theca interna, the surrounding layer, right? This is first polar body, and this cavity which has started developing has grown into a larger size cavity, and this is what you call it as antrum. So a Graafian follicle has a fluid filled cavity and we call it as antrum, right? Okay, so this is what you call it as antrum, and it is filled with fluid. It is all the granulosa cells. Now this is what you call it as the secondary oocyte. Secondary oocyte develops another one layer surrounding it, which is called zona pellucida, and this red layer of cells is what you can see is the cells of corona radiata, right? So this inside this structure is secondary oocyte, which has two layers, zona pellucida and corona radiata, and this is the small polar body. So what is the ploidy level? It is haploid, and this is also haploid. Why? Because meiosis 1 is completed. Okay. So now this is a mature follicle. We call it as Graafian follicle. And now at puberty, what happens? Ovulation occurs. So ovulation is what? Release of ova from the ovary. So at this stage, ova will be released from at which stage? Ovum, actually it is also called a secondary oocyte, and that is released from the stage called Graafian follicle. So at which stage does the ovulation occur? It occurs at the stage called Graafian follicle stage, which is known as a mature follicle. Okay, so now what is happening? Now you can say that ovulation is occurring. So how? You can see that this is what I have drawn the follicle, and from this secondary oocyte is released. Now I told you over there also that the secondary oocyte is having a layer of cell. We call it as corona radiata. Inside it there is one another layer. We call it as zona pellucida. And this is the secondary oocyte which is released. So this is basically what we call it as ovum, right? So you can say that yes, ovulation has occurred. So ovulation occurs at which stage? Secondary oocyte. Remember this, secondary oocyte. Yes. Why we call it a secondary oocyte? Because just now meiosis 1 is only completed. Meiosis 2 is yet pending. After completion of meiosis 2, we will call it as ova. Remember this, okay? So what we can say, this is that ova which is released from this Graafian follicle. So it breaks the Graafian follicle and the ova is released. Along with that, this first polar body is also released. We know that it degenerates because it is so small in size and it is not having enough nourishment. Further, so what will be the fate of this follicle? Let me tell you that this remnant of this Graafian follicle will be converted into a structure called corpus luteum. It will be converted into a structure called corpus luteum. So from this Graafian follicle, two things are formed. Ova is released at the secondary oocyte stage, and the remaining portion is known as corpus luteum. This corpus luteum is a temporary gland. Remember that? And it secretes a hormone called progesterone. Remember this. Okay. So once the ovulation occurs, two things are formed. One is the corpus luteum, that is known as a temporary gland, and the another one is the secondary oocyte. Now what happens to this secondary oocyte? Once ovulation occurs, secondary oocyte is released from the ovary, right? So this goes to the second resting stage. Okay. Now first resting stage we have already seen. So this goes to the second resting stage, which is called in the metaphase of meiosis 2. So first resting phase was prophase diplotin, right? Here it is metaphase of meiosis 2, here it arrests, right? So here it remains arrested. Now when this will get completed, the question is when the sperm will penetrate. Remember that, right? So we do consider that the ovulation, ovum is released, but actually fully matured ovum is not released. It is always at a pause, we can say, at the secondary oocyte stage. And when does the secondary oocyte gets completed? The question is when the sperm penetrates. If the sperm does not penetrate, it will remain at the secondary oocyte only and it gets degenerated. So this is the basic, and this ovulation starts at, I'll just write it over here, ovulation starts at which stage? So we'll say that this starts at puberty, right? So when we can say the female is sexually mature, so it starts releasing ova from the ovary. So this is all about what we can say oogenesis. Just a quick revision to all of you. We can say that the first, what is formed? We know that from oogonia, primary oocyte is formed, which is diploid. It is surrounded by the cells. We call it as granulosa cells, which is known as primary follicle. Now these primary follicle keeps on growing into secondary follicle, then it forms this tertiary follicle. You can see the differences. It matures into the Graafian follicle, and at the Graafian follicle you can say that the secondary oocyte is formed and released. So this is basically the process, what you call it as oogenesis, that starts from the fetal life to the puberty, and it continues to do so till the menopause. Now let us see the same process with the help of a chart. I have explained you already. Now we know that the oogonia that germinates or that divides from germinal epithelium, it starts at the fetal stage. So what happens at the fetal stage? The oogonia divide by mitosis and it forms primary oocyte. Both ploidy level they are diploid, right? So it will be having 46 and 46 numbers of chromosome. Now we know that 60 to 80,000 primary oocyte is formed. And then from birth to childhood, it keeps on getting converted into different follicles. So over here, there is a primary oocyte in the follicles, that is primary and the secondary follicle, right? Over here, then at puberty, the primary oocyte completes its meiosis 1, which was at the first resting phase. I told you that is diploid 10. And then onwards, it forms first polar body in the secondary oocyte. So what is this? This ploidy level is, so it is also haploid and this is also haploid, because we know that meiosis 1 is completed. And at what stage this meiosis 1 is getting completed? It is getting completed at puberty. Puberty means what? The female is now sexually mature. So this secondary oocyte is then released from the Graafian follicle. And then onwards, this division matters a lot now. This occurs only if the sperm enters. Right? So if the sperm enters, the secondary oocyte will be converted into ovum. Otherwise, it will remain as it is and it will degenerate. Also, let us see, because we know that secondary oocyte is at the second resting phase, at the metaphase stage. And this resting phase will be, what you can say, preceded by the sperm if it enters. And if it does not, it will just get ended over there only. Right, so this is something to note over here, that it's not the ovum which is released, it's actually the secondary oocyte that is released. Okay, so we can say that, but remember in your book it is even written that ovum is released, and then in the bracket they have given secondary oocyte. So this is the point that is needed to be cleared over here. Alright, now let us see how does it appears in the ovary. Like if you see the ovary, what kind of stages will you see? Now you can see that these are the blood vessels, this is primary follicles. It grows into secondary follicle, which is having primary oocyte. It grows into tertiary follicle, which is having a primary oocyte. Now you can see that the antrum has started developing. The antrum has fully developed into a Graafian follicle, and this Graafian follicle will be having the secondary oocyte. Remember that. Right? So from here you can say ovum. I will say again ovum oblique secondary oocyte is released. Right? So at this stage what you can say, ovulation has occurred. Ovum is released from the ovary. So in ovary what remains? The remaining part, which you call it as corpus luteum. So corpus luteum will stay for a certain period of time, and then it will start degenerating. The function of corpus luteum is to secrete progesterone. Remember that. Okay. So if the female does not conceive or does not becomes pregnant, this corpus luteum will degenerate. And if she becomes pregnant, so if the sperm has entered, remember that the corpus luteum will stay in the body for 9 months together, and it will support the pregnancy. So we can say that we will see later on. But remember that if what you can say, if the female undergoes menstruation, this is because the corpus luteum degenerates, right? Okay, so one point to remember, that the ovulation takes place at the Graafian follicle stage, and at the end when ova is released, also known as secondary oocyte, Graafian follicle is getting converted into corpus luteum, which is a temporary gland, and it secretes a hormone called progesterone. So this is all about oogenesis.